Well, welcome everyone to session 2 in our winter webinar series, Salinity and Potato Production. My name's Larsen from RMCG. And today in session 2, know your salts to better manage potato nutrition. So if you joined us earlier in the week for monitoring for improved management, this is the follow-on session. And if you haven't, you can catch up on the recording on the Soil Wealth ICP website. But again, today we're joined by Julie Finnigan from Servag and Doris Blaesing from RMCG down in Devonport in Tasmania. And we've got Bruce Scott from EE Muir and Son and Campbell's Fertiliser and myself in Victoria. And look, if you haven't joined one of these sessions before, just some quick housekeeping. You'll see on the side control panel there in GoToWebinar. You've got the option to ask us some questions anytime and they'll come directly through to me and we can put them to our expert panel. And there's also a number of handouts there that you can download and take away with you from the session today as well. But we've got half an hour to run through a bit more around understanding our salts, and we're going to deep dive into nutrition. And I might hand over to Julie to kick us off and we'll take it from there. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you very much, Carl, and welcome back to all those that were viewing on Tuesday afternoon, and welcome to those that are joining for the first time this afternoon. Just in partnership with the webinar series that we are running, just a reminder that we have a series of fact sheets that provide a little bit more information to back up what you will be hearing today, or as a resource further down the track. So. And importantly, I'd like to acknowledge a lot of the people who have been involved in this project. Importantly, we've got our funding bodies, the fresh potato industry, the processing potato industry, Hort Innovation, the Australian Government, RMCG, AusVeg, SA have been involved, Soil Wealth, AHR participating in today. The likes of Bruce and the EE Muir and Sons team who have been doing an amazing job out in the field, and everyone within Servag as well. So thank you to everyone who's been involved. In particular, a big thank you to all of those who have participated in the project and enabled us to have access to your properties. It's greatly appreciated. So today we're really going to start looking at salinity in terms of plant health, nutrition and soil structure, in looking at really what salts are what, how does it affect what we're growing. So when we're looking at growing a potato crop, it's fairly important that we get these things right, and salinity in both our irrigation water and our soils can greatly impact how we can do this in terms of yield and quality of products. So what salts are what? Quite often, we look at measuring and monitoring and testing our soils and water, and quite often we'll see values here or units of measurement in terms of EC water, an EC 1 to 5 with our soil tests, or we might see an EC SC for a saturation extract where we're looking at threshold levels that various plants can cope with salinity levels. But ultimately, this is all looking at total dissolved salts, and it doesn't really tell us, unless we dive a little bit deeper and do laboratory testing, what salts are what and what we're actually dealing with. And that's really important to understanding how we can manage our nutrition, isn't it, Doris?
I guess because actually the nutrients, if you look at it, they're also salts. It's the salt that we don't like, the sodium and chloride, which you might put on your eggs in the morning, is the nasty bit, and it's unfortunately competing with nutrients. So we want to talk about how we can deal with it.
Absolutely.
Because you can't get rid of the salts completely if it's in your water.
No, that's right. Yeah, if it's in your water supply, it's really hard to get rid of it. So it's a matter of managing it when we do apply it. So, and for anyone that didn't quite pick up on that, Doris said it's the salt that we put on our eggs and bacon of a morning. So good old salinity, sodium chloride, is our table salt.
Yep.
So, and just following on here, we have our cations and our anions, but it's the sodium and the chloride that together make sodium chloride table salt, which causes a lot of the issues when we're dealing with salinity in both our irrigation water sources and our soil types. Some soil types are different to others, some hold more salts than others, but in particular, these are the areas that we really need to focus on when we're trying to understand what salts that we're dealing with. Both are very, very important. So with this slide here, we're looking at sodium. So sodium is one of the most soluble of all the cations. So if there's water in the profile, it's really going to move around quite quickly and incredibly damaging to plant health and yields. So just looking at the graph here on the left, these are some of the upper levels of sodium in irrigation water that we measured in the Northern Adelaide Plains, the southeast, limestone coast, and the Mallee. So the red line that you're seeing here is the upper threshold level of about 74 parts per million. And these are the levels that we were seeing, some of the upper levels in the irrigation water supplies being used for potato production in South Australia. So as you can see, they're incredibly high. And, you know, that definitely will affect your plant health and yield. And in particular, it affects your calcium and potassium uptake. Doris?
Yeah, and sodium is really useless. I mean, that's the sad thing. You could see chloride is actually a little bit of a plant nutrient, but sodium is really useless. And plants are really stupid. They can't distinguish between sodium and potassium, which means they happily take up that easy to get potassium, sodium instead of potassium. So you get a plant that's eating like sodium like lollies, and the good stuff doesn't get in. So it's a real issue supplying the plant with enough potassium, and potassium is really important to regulate water loss. So the other thing is, if the plant doesn't have enough potassium, it will lose water at a great rate of knots through the stomata. So there's a double whammy, really, not having a nutrient and not having the nutrient function of dealing with water loss.
Absolutely.
In South Australia, it's important.
And then we've got the extra heat on top of that, and the stress combined with getting water to the plant. So yeah, really, really important element to be looking at when we're trying to assess salinity and manage it importantly. So, but it also can impact on disease resistance. If as soon as we get a weakened plant, it's susceptible to more diseases. Storage capacity and nitrogen uptake can even affect your specific gravity of your potatoes, particularly in the processing industry. That's the effect on the plants, but then it's also the ongoing effect of the additional salt or sodium that we're adding to the soil and how it can affect our soil structure. We touched on a little bit the other day in that when we get excess sodium in our soils, it affects the structure. We can get slumping, we can get crusting occurring. It impedes water uptake, nutrient uptake, oxygen movement.
You can actually see that quite well on the image that Julie has put on the presentation. When you get this kind of even sloshy bit, that's certainly a sign of poor soil structure. So if you would put some of these crumbs in a plate of water, it would just water bits. Whereas if you had better soil structure, it wouldn't water bits. And I guess one of the things you could do you could do is increasing organic matter levels. Again, in potato production, there's a lot of soil management, tillage, and eating up organic matter, whereas adding it would actually help a little bit. I've seen quite acidic soils where there's enough organic matter and things were much easier to handle.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So the good old compost might be something to try. I know it's not easy, but it is one aspect that might help.
So, and we will look at this in terms of soil amendments that we can apply to help with salinity in our fourth webinar, which is next Thursday afternoon. We will talk about that in more detail. So sodium is a really important nutrient or non-nutrient to look at.
Poison?
But it must be really monitored to make sure we understand the implications with the potato nutrition. So chloride is another really interesting one. Of the anions, it's the most soluble, and it can be incredibly toxic to potatoes. So again, this little graph here, we're looking at irrigation water chloride levels in the Northern Adelaide Plains, the southeast and the Mallee. So these are some of the upper levels, and at 200 milligrams or parts per million, we're looking at the upper threshold for potatoes, and particularly on an ongoing basis. You certainly wouldn't want to have much more than that. But if we look at our irrigation water levels, in some regions we're applying, 4 or 5 times as much chloride as desirable to our crops and to our soils. So some of the impact on this to potato plants is phenomenal in terms of scorching of the leaves, decreased photosynthesis, impaired nutrient moisture uptake, Bruce, would you like to have some input here as well in terms of what you've seen with the toxicity of chloride?
Well, Julie, one of the key things, I suppose, is that the three really important elements, potassium, calcium and nitrogen, can all be affected by sodium and chloride. Chloride has the biggest impact on the nitrate, but it's obviously affecting everything to do with the plant. And yeah, just avoiding chloride fertilisers is one of the key components to getting a different risk profile, I guess, for managing spuds under these conditions.
Yeah.
So the old Muir
potash
is
also applicable to the Western District.
My favourites as far as fertilisers go for using under these conditions. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Bruce. I was going to say also applicable to some of the western growing regions of Victoria. I know we've got a few agronomists joining us from that part of the world too, but yeah, probably something that they've experienced and managed day to day too.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Absolutely, and as much as this project is focused on South Australia, it's a real, I suppose, an awareness thing for everyone to be testing their soil, their water, their crops during growth, because salinity is a national issue. It affects so much of our agricultural land, and whilst you might not see visible signs and symptoms on the ground, you could be losing dollars in lost yield and quality because of salinity without knowing it. So,
yes,
you know, it's so cheap to run some tests and to be proactive than to be behind the 8 ball and to lose a crop because of salinity and because it come unexpectedly.
Yeah, as you said in the last session, 10% or even 20% yield difference you actually don't see.
Yeah, quite often you don't see it, do you? Yeah.
And Julie, that might be a good time to launch that quick poll just for some audience participation. We've got a poll up on your screen at the moment. Do you undertake SAP testing? If you wanted just to click yes or no, we can share back some results with everyone just to see who's doing what in terms of testing, because you mentioned the importance of it there. So I can see we've just got over half the people voted now and coming up to 3/4. So what I might do is close that poll and just share the results back. So Julie, what's that telling us? We've got 86% of the audience saying yes, we do undertake SAP testing. So that's a great result, great thing to see with everyone online. So thanks very much for that.
Absolutely, well done to everyone involved there. So here's looking at soil sodium levels. Again, this is within the project work that we did in Adelaide, or sorry, in South Australia potato growing regions. What we found was, because we're adding sodium and chloride to our soils every time we irrigate, that we are seeing an increase in soil sodium levels from start to finish of our irrigation season with our potatoes. So this graph here shows that, you know, the upper soil sodium or desirable level is about 100 parts per million. And at the start of the season, on average, we were above that level. But again, by the end of the season, we're at least double what would be desirable. So again, you know, we're adding salts to this system. They do accumulate, and sometimes they can be very hard to get rid of. But yeah, in terms of here, you know, while this is sort of an average level, some regions, some different soil types, you know, at least 6 times higher soil sodium levels at the end of the season. So again, it's really important to do your testing so that we can manage this through nutrition, irrigation, etc.
That's probably the hardest thing. People ask how do I get rid of it, and you can't get rid of it if you don't have any other water.
No.
Apart from doing some rain dancing, that helps. But,
well, certainly in some regions where there's not cropping continuously, there's the benefit of the rainfall that helps to flush the salts out of the system by the time we get to another 4 or 5 years down the track and we've got another potato crop. But certainly for those people who are cropping more continuously, it's really, really hard to get rid of that salt.
Yes, especially in greenhouses. I mean, with the work we're doing in the Adelaide plants with greenhouse growers, it's just really challenging because obviously there's no rain and there's no fresh water.
No, that's right.
So people are really struggling with the effects of salinity.
And it's yeah, it'd be nice to see some of that natural rainfall captured off of those.
Yes, so there's another.
Anyway.
Ones, yeah.
So again, we touched on this a little bit before, but when we're applying the sodium and the chloride to our soils, it is not only deleterious to our crops in terms of the health of the crop, but it does affect soil structure, and that can have a massive impact on the healthy functioning of your potato crops as well. We mentioned it before, they can be really hard setting at the surface, so germination might be really poor. When it sets hard, you don't get water infiltration as effectively in the water mounds. And we can get surface cracking, and I've seen some roots on plants that are totally exposed because soils have cracked, sufficiently so they can become really sticky during wet conditions, and it's just really difficult for plants to be able to function properly when those sodium levels are excessively high. So typically we talk about them as if it's above 6% of the exchangeable cations, that's when we're looking at a sodic soil, not just a saline soil. And again, Doris has got some fact sheets on.
Yep, so there's managing salinity in vegetables. These are always these fact sheets. They are a very interesting thing to write, because there's a lot of books talking about it at length. To put it into 5 sheets, we're usually quite proud of that. And Julie and Bruce have helped with this.
It is a challenge, but it's always good to have something you can sort of pick up and pull some information from.
There's some actually information about differences with saline tonic or saline, or so it takes a while to take it in, but it probably might be worth looking at.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they're on the Soilworth website.
And just a reminder for everyone too, they are on the control panel there, just to quickly download, so you don't have to go searching the web. They're there for you to take away and have a bit more of a read of.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Thanks for the reminder. So calcium, that's a really, really important nutrient for potato production, and it does have a significant role in the development of the tubers. So calcium really must be available to those tubers in the early phases, and I think what most of the research is now showing is that for the tubers to take up the calcium, it must be absorbed through the stolons, so it must be available, must be present within that area. Bruce, what have you sort of noticed with potato production or vegetable production, and being able to get calcium through?
Yeah. One of the really important things is just the big role of calcium in plants. It's one of the biggest numbers when you do your leaf testing or tuber testing. It's a very important element for cell structure and all that we know that it does, but it has to be there in an available form. So a lot of people would apply gypsum as a means of trying to deal with salinity and salt buildup, but gypsum's relatively insoluble. So we're looking for something that is soluble. So the 2 major components we're using are calcium nitrate and more recently calcium thiosulfate. Both of those are working beautifully at trying to counteract the effects of sodium. So normally calcium is the cation present in the soil moisture or the soil solution in the highest quantity. But when you've got salty water, it ends up being sodium instead of calcium. So we've got to try to balance that again. So using those available forms of calcium is the trick we've got up our sleeve, if you like, to try to overcome the detrimental effects of the sodium. So, yep, very
absolutely.
Yeah. And certainly having it soil applied is actually, potatoes are so fussy, it has to be in the soil, and the tuber gets fed by its own roots. And so you can't even feed a single tuber if it doesn't have any roots to take up the calcium. And certainly the calcium doesn't go downwards, it only goes upwards in the plant. So it's something, by putting foliar sprays on, the plant would still like it, but it's not going to the tubers.
It won't have tuber development. Yeah.
We're trying to bathe the tubers, if you like, in calcium, and to overcome the fact that they're bathing in sodium if we don't do something about it.
Yep.
Absolutely. And so, if we're lacking in the calcium available to the tubers, this is where we start getting, breakdown of cell walls, poor storage quality, again, disease resistance isn't as good.
It's very important. Yeah. And also for root systems, calcium is actually, apart from cell walls, really important as a in the cell liquids itself, in the liquid phase, especially in root tips. So really important for early root development together with phosphorus. Don't mix it. One. People know that though.
Okay, so potassium. Again, potatoes are big users of potassium throughout their growth, and it does play a really important role in transforming those sugars into starches. But as we've mentioned earlier, if we've got excess sodium, that's when the uptake and the availability of the potassium is really hampered by the sodium.
And something people often forget, often soils are reasonably high in potassium, but still, first thing the sodium, but also potatoes, when they really grow rapidly, or any crop, will need often more potassium than the soil can deliver, even though it's there, but the train is a bit slow in delivery. So that's a really important thing to remember. So foliar application of potassium at the right time can be quite helpful. And also, it's the nutrient actually with a lot of plants, and including potatoes, if you would look at total nutrient removal, potassium is higher than nitrogen. So we always put on the nitrogen, but not the potassium. So the uptake and removal is actually of potassium is larger than of nitrogen. So really that's important to remember.
So yes, if we have deficiencies, again, there's a whole host of poor quality, effects on specific gravity, tuber size, and so forth.
Stem and brine, you get calcium and potassium really for potatoes are extremely important.
Okay, so if we move on, when we look at irrigation water quality in South Australia in particular, the irrigation water not only has high sodium and chloride levels that hamper productivity of potato crops, there's other issues as well that hamper the delivery of water and can affect the salinity of the soil in some ways as well. So most of the irrigation waters that we tested in South Australia had pHs above 7, whereas ideally you'd like it around that 7 mark. But in particular, they're very high in carbonates and bicarbonates. So one of the things that we found is that quite often they will precipitate out, and therefore it sort of leaves the sodium more dominant in the soil with those precipitating out. The other thing it can do is it can affect the clogging of irrigation lines and nozzles and everything else that's involved with that delivery of the water. So yes, unfortunately for South Australia in particular, it's not just the sodium and the chloride that can be deleterious to irrigation, but it's these other factors involved with the water quality as well.
In other bore water,
very true.
As well, it's not only bore water seems to often have these high carbonates and bicarbonates. That also, of course, is an issue for spraying. Some people use that water for spraying, and there's a pH and the quality of water is really important, which is another topic, but it's worth remembering.
Absolutely. So the level of hardness as well that we found across South Australia was really quite high. So again, the upper level, which is typically monitored by the calcium carbonate concentrations, is 100 parts per million. Again, you can see in the Northern Addo Plains, Southeast and the Mallee, that hardness is really quite high and well above the levels that are acceptable for irrigation purposes. So I suppose the other thing to think of is it's not just the calcium and magnesium salts in the hardness, but it is a level of the iron, the magnesium, aluminium and zinc as well. So in some cases even the hard water can see high levels of iron algae build-up, which can cause blockages as well. So, and the fact that the sodium can precipitate, the calcium and bicarbonates can precipitate out, we get that sort of bulk level of sodium building up in the soil as well.
So I guess in the pivot irrigators, is it just changing of nozzles all the time, or what do people do?
Well, it can be, and one of the things that these guys are really struggling with is we know variable rate irrigation can be so beneficial for crop production, be it potato production or anything else, in terms of the even delivery of water or being able to turn on water or turn off water where it's needed when we're looking at variable conditions within the paddock. And you know, VRI and the application of that when we've got these waters high in calcium carbonates, it causes all sorts of issues with blockages. And you know, growers are trying to implement changes, but again, it's really hard to change the water quality, and I think very expensive to start changing all your nozzles and all the other little bits and pieces to try and make them function properly with this quality water. So it's one of the downsides, I suppose, with the hard water.
And then in drip irrigation as well.
Yeah, that's right.
It can be quite challenging because the drippers block up.
Yeah.
In some areas, plants die very quickly if the drippers are blocked.
Yep, no water. So I know we're getting short on time here, but one of the things I think really is important is when we start looking at our fertilisers and what salts are in the fertilisers. Sorry, we didn't do a poll, did we?
We didn't do a poll yet, no.
No. So one of the things that we need to consider when we're applying fertilisers is what salts are actually in them. So many fertilisers contain salts, and it's a matter of what salts and the quantity that needs to be looked at. But so many fertilisers in particular will have chloride in them, and in particular the likes of MOP, which is often used for potato production, it is potassium chloride. So
It's actually paying for the chloride. About half of the fertiliser is chloride.
So when we're throwing it on in bucket loads in the irrigation water,
you're paying for more.
So Julie, I've just got that poll up at the moment asking our audience if they are using MOP. So if you just wanted to click one of those options on your screen now, yes, no, or unsure, Bruce, we might go to you and then I can share back the results.
Fantastic.
Yeah, look, I think the important things to realise with fertilisers is that they do have a salt index. You can find out that sodium nitrate obviously is a no-no, but some of the other fertilisers have a high salt index, which adds to the salting problem. But the two main things to be wary of are chloride and ammonium. So often when in the later stages when we're looking at calcium nitrate or potassium nitrate applications on spuds, it's particularly because we want the nitrate to help with the uptake of the cation, whether it's potassium or calcium. So they work in hand, whereas ammonium is competing with calcium and potassium. So it's pretty important to know when you're putting your fertilisers on and what's going to happen when you do it, and try to avoid the ones that are causing more problems than creating a good result.
And so the results from our poll there is our audience using MOP. So we've got roughly 90% saying no, 10% unsure. So that's good to see. And just a little bit of quick trivia there. We were looking at what muriate actually meant, and it's an ancient word for chloride. So there you go. Next time you see that, you can remember.
Yep, it's actually nicer word, but it disguises how nice it is.
Same outcome.
Right.
So with regard to the types of fertilisers though, some of the trials that we have looked at, I know Bruce has done a lot of work in this area, is the ability of the calcium thiosulfate and its ability to help flush the chlorides from that root environment. So this little graph here on the left, we're looking at chloride levels in sap in our plants. That's in the blue, and the nitrate blue is pre-application of calcium thiosulfate. And what we've managed to do is actually drop the chloride levels, which has increased the availability and uptake of the nitrate required by the plant. So it's enabled that flushing and the ability of the chloride levels to lower a little bit to enable that nitrate uptake more efficiently within our potato plants.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity, Julie, for people that are irrigating. Obviously, if you're able to put the calcium thiosulfate through the system, you can put it exactly where you need it and get the results to help ameliorate what's going on with the sodium chloride. Yep.
Absolutely. So I know we're running short of time. We'll just quickly run through this last slide, looking at irrigation management. So uniform soil watering is really imperative. The ability to get that uniform watering though, and avoiding the drying and the wetting patterns is really difficult for many of the areas where we're seeing really hot weather, high sandy soils, and quite often there's that hydrophobic soils or sands that are very incredibly hard to wet up. The water just runs off of them. So it's really difficult sometimes to get that water to the plants, but they do need that regular flushing and prevention of the drying, because as the water dries back up again, it just carries the sodium and the chloride back up into that root zone. So irrigation management in that regard is really important. We touched on a lot of the techniques and tools, etc., that can assist growers with monitoring that, and I think
we got another meeting. Oh, it's actually a Zoom meeting, so you can all talk to us and each other on the 24th of July. June. So 24th of June. If at the same time, going to actually talk with Julie, but also some other experts around irrigation management, and where you can ask more questions as well.
Absolutely. And with our third webinar coming up, we're looking at managing hydrophobic soils and how some of the products can really assist with improving the initial wetting and maintaining that soil moisture, which helps with the uptake of nutrients and everything else that we need for our potato crop. So I think on that note, again, we'll say thank you. Many thanks to Doris and Bruce and Carl, and for everyone that's participated. And I'll throw it back to you, Carl, for anyone that's got questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Julie. I am conscious of people's time. We've had a couple of questions come through, and one that Mark's raised I particularly like and wanted to make sure we got to. We talked quite a bit around the importance of potassium and calcium in potato production. Mark's question was just asking, is there some information or guidance about the critical levels for some of those nutrients like potassium and calcium?
For potatoes?
For potatoes in sap, definitely.
Yeah, there is.
Yes.
I suppose there is upper levels, guidance levels, thresholds, etc.
Are there those fact sheets?
No.
Oh, we have to make another fact sheet.
No, not really.
So definitely there are good guidance levels of what the desirable levels are, especially in the lab-based step tests.
Absolutely, and quite often you'll find your agronomist will talk about those levels with you and the results that you receive from them. But in terms of another additional fact sheet, I don't think we've got any floating.
Well, this one might have some general information actually on the, it has, and there's also a plant analysis and interpretation guide that will have some information as well on ranges of desirable levels and sap.
Yeah, great. No, thanks, Doris. Thanks, Julie. So, Mark, just to wrap up there, download those handouts, all four from the control panel there. The plant analysis guide is up on the Soil Wealth ICP website under the resources tab, and it's right up the top, so it's easy to find. So we've just recently released that back in February. So look, thank you very much again, Julie, Doris and Bruce, for your expertise and time. We really hope everyone's enjoying this webinar series. So they'll be available up on the Soil Wealth website to watch the recording if you did want to pass it on to a colleague or someone else within your business. Next week, as Julie's mentioned, we're tackling managing hydrophobic soils and also organic soil amendments. So if you haven't signed up for those couple of webinars and you'd like to attend, just jump to soilwealth.com.au/events and you can sign up in the click of a button, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you then.
Fantastic.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.